Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar to launch our new report, Securing Indo-Pacific Submarine Cable Networks, Options for Australia-India Cooperation. My name is Lisa Singh. I am the CEO of the Australia-India Institute, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We are going to have a dedicated Q&A session today towards the end of the hour that we have slotted for this webinar. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat box at any time, and I'll draw upon those later. So first and foremost, I'd just like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and emerging. Firstly, this report, it was very much informed and builds on the Australia-India Cables Dialogue 2025, Strengthening Submarine Cables Connectivity, that was a dialogue held in Perth in late July this year. That dialogue very much brought together government, business, research experts from Australia and India to look at how we can better secure undersea cable networks across the Indo-Pacific. A topic I know is becoming more and more of interest to our region and to researchers, government and industry alike. The project itself has been supported under the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Australia-India Cyber and Critical Technology Partnership Program. And the July dialogue was also supported by the Forest Research Foundation, and also we'd like to thank Vocus for hosting a site visit as part of that. Well, as we know, submarine cables carry almost all of the world's international data traffic. Everything from financial transactions to government communications and the everyday internet. And they are largely invisible in public debate and often, taken for granted by most of us. But in the Indo-Pacific, these seabed networks are expanding and being reconfigured just as strategic competition is intensifying. And recent incidents in other regions have shown how vulnerable critical undersea infrastructure can be in times of tensions or conflict. So this report that we are launching today very much examines the key challenges for submarine cable networks and sets out policy options for Australia and India to strengthen cooperation. Australia and India have distinct but complementary roles in addressing these themes and challenges. Australia invests in Pacific connectivity and specialised centres of expertise, while India is emerging as a major digital hub in the Indian Ocean with growing ambitions for sovereign infrastructure and repair capability. So with that context in mind of looking at our region and our two countries' contribution to this topic, I'm very delighted that we are joined by this report's three co-authors who will take us deeper into the findings and recommendations. So firstly, to Dr. Samuel Bashfield, who is a research fellow in global security at La Trobe University and an academic fellow at the Australia-India Institute. His work focuses on Indo-Pacific geopolitics, maritime security, and seabed infrastructure. Welcome, Sam. And then to Professor Balaji Parasarathi. He is a professor at the International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore, and co-founder of the Centre for Information Technology and Public Policy. His research spans global production networks, digital innovation, and social transformation. Welcome, Balaji. And to Dr. V. Sridhar. He is a professor at the Centre for IT and Public Policy at the International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore as well. And he is a leading expert on telecommunications regulation, spectrum management, and digital economies. So thank you to our three co-authors for being with us to unpack the findings and recommendations of this new and important report. So with that, I'd now like to hand over to each of them. I'm going to start with inviting Dr. Samuel Bashfield, to provide his opening remarks, covering the background of the report, the key challenges facing submarine cables in the Indo-Pacific, and Australia's current policy settings. Over to you, Sam.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Lisa. So, as you note, this report is part of a multi-year research project that's a collaboration between the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne and the International Institute of Information Technology in Bangalore. And this is all supported very generously by an Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Australia-India Cyber and Critical Technology Partnership Grant. And this grant isn't just supporting the report that we're launching today, but really a comprehensive body of work, including the Australia-India Cables Dialogue we held in Perth in July 2025, but also a series of shorter analytical papers and also ongoing research into a journal article that will come out soon on Indian Ocean data flows. I particularly want to acknowledge as well the participants of our Australia-India Cables Dialogue, which we convened in Perth, Australia's Indian Ocean capital, on 31 July as part of this grant. And that dialogue brought together leading submarine cable industry experts, government officials, and researchers from both countries. And I know many of the collaborators are on the call now, so welcome. But let me explain why we've undertaken this work and why it matters. So, as Lisa mentioned, submarine cables are genuinely the backbone of our digital society. They carry around 99% of global data traffic, and everything we do online, from video calls, financial transactions, streaming, cloud computing, for example, depends on these cables that lie on the sea floor and connect our respective shores. But the challenge is that as geopolitical tensions rise across our region, these submarine cable networks are increasingly contested. So what I'll do is I'll overview some of the key challenges for submarine cable protection in our part of the world. The first I'd note is this connectivity gap. So this gap persists in Indo-Pacific submarine connectivity, and networks have traditionally been driven by commercial interests, not national, which leave these gaps among various societies. The Indian Ocean really lacks a comprehensive cable backbone. Many East African nations and Indian Ocean island nations, for example, have very limited options. The South Pacific remains underserved, and many nations lack redundant connectivity, making them really vulnerable to outages, whether from natural phenomena, accidents, negligence, or even malicious activity. There's no direct cable currently between Australia and India, which is interesting considering our two major democracies with deep strategic ties route all of our data through Singapore. And this creates a dependency on third-party infrastructure and distinct connectivity risks. But these gaps, I'd argue, are also opportunities for Australia and India to support trusted network development, to piggyback off hyperscalers, so Google and Meta projects, for example, by funding branches, and also by establishing our territories as digital hubs, and you'll hear more about that later on. The second challenge I'd identify is preparedness gaps for cable security incidents. So current preparedness levels reveal concerning gaps in both how Australia and India are preparing, particularly as geopolitical tensions escalate and regional risks of deliberate cable targeting abound. We've seen recent incidents, very concerning incidents, concerning submarine cables in Europe, especially the Baltic Sea, in the waters off Yemen and Taiwan, demonstrating that these security concerns, whether sabotage or accidents or other causes, have really shifted from a theoretical and a historical problem to a real contemporary challenge. But I'd argue that both nations remain largely unprepared for coordinated incidents, whether in deep water, beyond national jurisdiction, or in territorial seas. Now, Australia has some frameworks that I'll talk to in a moment. We do enforce cable protection legislation and maintain limited protection zones off Sydney and Perth, but India lacks comparable frameworks despite its critical dependence on this cable infrastructure. The repair challenges is perhaps situational, I'd put it. Commercial repair arrangements work well under normal peacetime conditions with relatively predictable cable fault patterns, but neither nation maintains or can direct dedicated repair vessels positioned for rapid response across the vast Indian Ocean. Current repair times average longer than a month in India, which perhaps is manageable for isolated incidents. But the concern is what happens during heightened geopolitical tensions or if multiple cables were compromised simultaneously. And the challenge extends beyond technical capabilities to developing appropriate response strategies. So traditional approaches to cable security might prove insufficient in scenarios where adversaries might be willing to accept cable infrastructure losses in exchange for inflicting relatively greater damage on economies highly dependent on digital connectivity. The third challenge is this distinct supply chain vulnerability. So submarine cable supply chains present multiple vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The market's very concentrated. When we look at installation companies, only four major players dominate global cable installation. There's NEC of Japan, Subcom of the United States, Alcatel Submarine Networks of France, and HMN Tech of China. And both Australia and India, although we have companies that do play that are key in the submarine cable space, we lack indigenous manufacturing and installation industries. And instead, we rely on foreign suppliers, and we must ensure that they meet the appropriate security standards. The final challenge I'd highlight is coordination mechanisms. And what I mean is effective coordination between Australia and India and others in the region, which specifically require bilateral and multilateral frameworks. Bilaterally, there's a gap. Despite growing recognition of shared vulnerabilities, we lack formal coordination structures specifically focused on cable security. And now the Quad offers a natural framework, which my colleagues will speak to in a moment, that brings together four major Indo-Pacific democracies with significant naval, technological, and capabilities and shared concerns. But current Quad initiatives are making progress, but we do need to address these more systematically. Regional organizations, so the Indian Ocean Rim Association or Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, can provide additional venues, but success really requires developing new institutional arrangements that bridge these traditional boundaries between defense, telecommunications, and development policy. And for Australia and India, these matter significantly. We both have significant equities in submarine cable networks and depend entirely on them for international data connectivity. Now, what I'll do is I'll outline just a few of the points of what Australia's current policy setting is. So Australia's positioned itself as a relative regional leader through three main initiatives, and I'll walk through each of these in turn. So Australia's established cable protection zones several decades ago off our western and eastern coasts that criminalize actions which damage or potentially foul submarine cable networks. These zones have been regarded by some law experts as a gold standard of legislative model and provide frameworks that other nations could potentially adapt and adopt to their local jurisdictions. But they're not perfect, and these zones still lack adequate policing and legal enforcement. And also, despite the proliferation of cable landing points around Australia, these zones only exist off Perth and Sydney, leaving new networks unprotected and vulnerable. But nevertheless, the zones demonstrate Australia's early recognition that these cables require tailored legal safeguards as critical infrastructure. The second point is Australia's infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific, which was launched in 2018 with an initial $2 billion Australian dollar funding envelope. The AIFFP is Australia's primary vehicle for financing regional infrastructure, including submarine cable networks. And it was really established amid growing concerns about China's expanding infrastructure presence and potential debt trap diplomacy that could compromise sovereignty amongst Australia's region. The AIFFP offers alternative financing for high-impact safeguarded projects and has invested in a range of submarine cable projects across the region. The third is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Cable Connectivity and Resilience Centre, which was launched in July last year, and it was broadly launched under the Quad auspices. With 18 million Australian dollars allocated over 4 years, the centre really acts as a regional hub for policy research, technical assistance, and information sharing on submarine cable security in the region. And it has this wide Indo-Pacific mandate that focuses on policy-relevant research to inform regulatory frameworks, decision-making processes, and industry-government coordination. So this really represents, from the Australian side, an evolution towards a somewhat comprehensive coordination, moving beyond just financing infrastructure to building knowledge, building capacity, and coordinating mechanisms across the region. So that gives you a bit of a sense of what Australia's been doing to address these problems. But India is, of course, equally important, and India brings different but complementary strengths to this challenge. So I'll hand over to my colleagues who will discuss India's approach a little of the Quad before we get into some of the concrete policy options that we put forward in this report. So Lisa, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks very much, Sam. I mean, that was a really excellent overview of submarine cables throughout the Indo-Pacific, but also of the challenges and Australia's positioning in this space. So it's a good segue to introduce and invite Professor Balaji Parthasarathi to share his reflections in particular on India's policy and the Quad's role in submarine cable and security. Over to you, Balaji. We can't hear you, Balaji.
Oh, sorry, my audio was turned off. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Sam. Like Sam mentioned, I mean, countries have their own national interests towards this whole question of submarine cables. And although India and Australia are members of the Quad and the International Cable Protection Committee, their approaches have been different, which Sam has highlighted. And I'll go through a few of the details now. Now, India's approach to submarine cable security currently emphasizes domestic capability development and landing geography diversification. So while the nation serves as a critical connectivity hub, India's submarine cable policy development focuses primarily on national infrastructure sovereignty rather than broader Indo-Pacific initiatives. Indian telecom regulators are actively encouraging the development of indigenous submarine cable capabilities, and current policy priorities, including establishing an Indian-flagged repair capacity, diversifying cable landing locations beyond Mumbai and Chennai on the eastern and western coasts, and developing domestic submarine cable networks to connect Indian coastal cities and emerging data centers. I mean, for instance, we recently had the big announcement by Meta of a $15 billion investment in Visakhapatnam on the eastern coast. Now, these initiatives reflect India's recognition that its substantial service exports and growing digital economy require resilient, sovereign-controlled infrastructure. But despite India's sort of Quad membership and strategic Indian Ocean location, the nation currently lacks a regional strategy for submarine cable connectivity. And India does not currently finance cable infrastructure for neighboring Indian Ocean nations or lead regional resilience efforts. A September 2024 joint Quad statement did note that India will commission a feasibility study to assess expanding undersea cable maintenance and repair capabilities in the Indo-Pacific, and suggesting potential evolution towards a more regional engagement in repair capability. So this in a nutshell is where India stands. And now to sort of pull it together, both the Australian view and the Indian position within the larger Quad framework, I'll sort of highlight a few aspects of what's going on within the Quad itself. Now, the Quad partnership has emerged as a key regional framework for considering submarine cable security efforts in the Indo-Pacific. And the Quad first announced its submarine cable focus in May 2023 through the Quad Partnership for Cable Connectivity and Resilience, which was designed to strengthen cable systems in the Indo-Pacific, drawing on Quad countries' world-class expertise in manufacturing, delivering, and maintaining cable infrastructure. And I guess this primarily means at this point, the US and Japan, because neither India nor Australia have the manufacturing and expertise. Now, this partnership established the foundation for coordinated action, with Australia agreeing to establish what became the Cable Connectivity and Resilience Center, quite similar to the US Cables program. Now, in September 2024, the Wilmington Declaration at the Fourth Quad Leaders Summit reinforced these commitments, noting that robust funding would support Quad priorities and celebrate early successes, including Australia's Cable Connectivity and Resilience Center, Japan's Pacific Technical Assistance, and the US Cables program. The leaders had thus far committed about $140 million in cable network funding and pledged to connect all Pacific Island nations with secure cable networks, while emphasizing a commitment to an inclusive, open, sustainable, safe, reliable, and secure digital future. Now, the Quad's influence extends beyond its 4 members through initiatives, including the September 2024 New York Joint Statement on the Security and Resilience of Undersea Cables, which gained endorsement from 20 nations, including the UK, the European Union, Canada, and multiple Pacific Island states. Now, this statement established key principles, including resilient design requirements, use of secure and verifiable suppliers, enhanced industry-government coordination, and comprehensive risk assessment frameworks. More importantly, the New York Statement recognized submarine cables as part of a broader ecosystem encompassing construction, operation, surveillance, maintenance, and repair, such as landing stations, software, and the terrestrial parts of the submarine cable connecting to them, repair centers, as well as the fleet of deployment, maintenance, and repair vessels. Despite these sort of high-level commitments, Quad Submarine Cable Initiative faces implementations uncertainties. A planned Quad Action Plan to protect commercial undersea telecommunication cables, which was announced in late 2024, has not yet materialized, and the change in the US administration has introduced additional uncertainty, with the Trump White House removing previous Quad Summit materials from official websites. Now, these developments highlight the ongoing challenges of translating multilateral commitments into concrete, sustained action on submarine cable security. Sam mentioned, there are challenges both India and Australia face, and the current approaches, however, reveal both potential and limitations of existing cable security efforts in the Indo-Pacific. And in order to sort of highlight and sort of expand on the policy options, or discuss the policy option, I'll turn the floor over to my colleague Lisa, and then on to Sridhar. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Balaji. It was really good to hear about India's policy positioning on some of this, but also the Quad initiatives, and so much that we hold hope for with the Quad as it continues to exist. So with that, I would like to turn to you, Sridhar, for your remarks, particularly on the policy options and recommendations we can think about in terms of both of our countries' cooperation on submarine cables.
So thank you, Lisa. So we have basically divided the policy options into 3 categories. The first one is promoting trusted regional connectivity projects. So Australia and India are in a favorable position to deepen collaboration in promoting a secure, resilient, and diversified submarine cable infrastructure network in the Indo-Pacific region. For example, if we look at the coastal and island states within the Indo-Pacific, they remain underserved, relying on a limited number of cable networks that are not always sourced from trusted suppliers. So in this context, trusted regional connectivity means more than just adding capacity. It involves diversifying routes, expanding access to underserved areas, embedding security standards in procurement, and supporting networks that would otherwise not be commercially viable. So the policy options include some of these things. For example, in the case of trusted regional connectivity, we want to have trusted subsea cable projects, which are jointly carried out by Australia and India. So this requires a little bit of co-investment for building sovereign, reliable networks. The second imperative is that we use offshore cable hubs. So, for example, India has also built submarine cable connectivity to Lakshadweep Islands on the west and Andaman Nicobar Islands on the east from the mainland. It has been constructed by the state-owned Bharat Sanchar Nigam Limited. Similarly, Christmas Island is also being connected to the mainland in Australia. So it is possible for us to have offshore cable hubs, such as one in Andaman Nicobar and the other one Christmas Island, in order to provide reliable connectivity between India and Australia. In fact, there is no direct connectivity as of now between India and Australia, and therefore these offshore cable hubs are potential opportunities for us to build safe routes between India and Australia. The third one is promoting safe cable routes. For example, we want to have diversity in cable networks, especially in the Indian Ocean. For example, Singapore has almost become a choke point for all the submarine cables. There are about 14 to 15 submarine cable landing stations present in Singapore, and most of the traffic from India to Australia have to go through Singapore. So in order to improve the trusted regional connectivity, India and Australia need to promote safe cable routes, at the same time bypassing some of the choke points, connecting offshore cable hubs. The fourth option is augmenting content delivery networks. For example, cable bandwidth and content go together. So, in fact, it is preferable that we have localized content delivery networks to serve large traffic generators, such as, for example, Amazon Prime, Netflix, and so on. So these are large traffic generators, are the ones which consume a lot of bandwidth, and therefore it is imperative for us to have localized CDNs. For example, India has already started, as Balaji mentioned, a huge AI data center in a place called Vizag, which does not have a landing station. But now all the hyperscalers, such as Meta and Google, are interested in constructing a cable landing station in Vizag to provide connectivity to the large data centers. And therefore, similarly in Australia, Perth and other places are also coming up as localized CDN centers, and therefore we need to augment the content delivery networks to provide trusted regional connectivity. The second policy option is securing network resilience. So network resilience has become very important, especially due to the geopolitics issues that we have. So it is the first policy option is to have common operating procedures and processes between India and Australia, so that we can secure the network and then improve the resiliency of the network, cable landing stations, as well as CDNs. Diversity by design, as I have already mentioned, we need to have diversity in the cable routes, especially between India and Australia, so that we avoid, for example, risky regions in the Indian Ocean, also the choke points in the Indian Ocean. The third policy option imperative is that we need to promote cable protection zones. Sam has already mentioned about the cable protection regulation, which has been there in practice in Australia. In India, we do not have such a regulation. In fact, in the National Telecom Policy 2025, it has been mentioned that the submarine cable systems have to be designated as critical information infrastructure. And therefore, with this, we will build jointly cable protection zones so that the resiliency of the cable systems are increased as much as possible. And the last one is coordinating naval and maritime activities so that we have an integrated cable monitoring, incident response, and crisis management for subsea cables. The third policy option is safeguarding repair supply chain. As Sam already mentioned, it takes more than a month in order to repair cable facilities. In fact, our data shows that it takes as much as about 60 days for a cable repair to be fully rectified. And this requires very harmonized cable repair deficiency addressing, and including, for example, local repair facilities and support for local support facilities. So supporting regional cable repair capabilities by both India and Australia will go a long way in improving the resiliency of the network, reduce downtime, and improve the efficiency of the submarine cable systems. So those are the policy options that we have outlined in the report. And over to you, Lisa.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sridhar. And look, thank you to all of our co-authors for your opening remarks and your insights of the report that we are launching today. To get us started, I'm going to first put a couple of general questions to the panel and then bring in any more from the audience. I will remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A chat on the Zoom function. You should see it down there, and we will go through them. But first, we are launching a really quite significant report today that our co-authors have already outlined in terms of some of the challenges, which I see as part one of the submarine cable challenges in the Indo-Pacific part of the report. So with that, I think it's a good place to start in terms of challenges vis-a-vis cooperation. And, I know that you outline the sort of connectivity gaps and the geopolitical risks in the Indo-Pacific. But I guess my question to you is what is the most sort of single most important step that Australia and India can take together in the next few years, for example, to make regional submarine networks more secure and resilient in our region? Who would like to answer that first?
I'll jump in, Lisa, if that's all right. I mean, I think we're in a really interesting position, both of our countries now, in that that global submarine cable network geography is changing, and it's changing due to artificial intelligence, and that we're seeing that the both the business model of laying these networks, it's no longer telecommunication companies collaborating together as much as it is Google and Meta and the other companies connecting their various AI inference and pr essentially AI production. So I think really harnessing the existing projects that are out there and that are taking place is one really important step that we can both take. And there's been interesting examples in the Pacific whereby the Australian government's been able to fund branching units off planned cable networks. And so rather than actually funding a cable network, the government assuming the entire cost, even if with other partners, that there is, there's a boom in terms of cable laying right now. And I think harnessing that is something that both countries can really do. And I was just on Christmas and Cocos Island recently, looking at all of the submarine cable infrastructure and technology there. And it was amazing to see the amount of money that's being put into Christmas Island to turn it into a hub. And that's something that we discussed back in July last year, but it's becoming a reality already. So I think I'd really highlight that working with industry and working with Australian and Indian players as well that are supporting these large hyperscaler projects is really a really good option worth pursuing.
If I may add,
Yes,
Lisa,
Balaji.
Sridhar here, yeah. So,
Sridhar, sorry.
yeah. So as of now, roughly about 500,000 route kilometers of submarine cables are being planned with an aggregate capacity of close to about 20,000 terabits per second. I mean, that's a lot. So if India and Australia can, influence these hyperscalers in order to have diversity in routes, improve cable connectivity in the Indian Ocean, it will go a long way. And therefore, it is important for both the governments in India and Australia to influence the future submarine cable projects, as Sam has already mentioned, to improve resiliency between the two countries and also to the rest of the world.
Excellent. Thank you. Look, I am obviously looking at the report as I'm asking you questions and listening to you. And so I will let our audience know that the report is available on the Australia India Institute's website now. And you can go to our website and access it there. I wanted to therefore make sure I delve a little bit deeper into how the report highlights concerns about supply chain concentration and the sort of risks of malign influence. So in that, can one of you sort of inform us as to sort of what could be practical safeguards for government or for regulators or for industry itself to prioritise to ensure that any new cable projects or indeed upgrades are generally trusted, so to speak? Sam?
I'll jump in if or Balaji, would you like to? Or sure. Well, I mean, I think, when it comes to this malign influence on submarine cable networks, I think, I outlined in my opening remarks that we have four major installers of submarine cable networks. HMN Tech of China was formerly Huawei Marine Networks. And I think both Australia and India have been very upfront and open when it comes to discussing the role of Chinese tech in telecommunications writ large, not just submarine submarine cable networks specifically. And I think Australia, for speaking from the Australian example, we have gone through quite intense processes in terms of deliberating and trying to understand what the supply chain risks of having Chinese tech within telecommunication networks means for our country. And ultimately it's been deemed an unacceptable risk. So I think when it comes, and it's important to note that there aren't any cables laid by Chinese suppliers that connect Australia and neither India, and that's not a coincidence. I think when it comes to what the two countries can do on this data integrity, data security question when it comes to supply chains, I think a lot of the work is working with other countries in our region, whether it be, Australia already does this work in the Pacific, but also in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia, to really help countries to understand those types of data security risks by using high-risk vendors, whether they be from China or otherwise. So I think it's less about what Australia and India can do themselves, but more how we operate in the region and how we can coordinate the outreach and the education that takes place with our partner countries when they're making decisions about the technology that connects their telecommunications networks.
Yeah.
Yes. Balaji, do you
Lisa,
want to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah. So I just wanted to sort of draw a historical analogy because, I think it was Sam who mentioned that it's no longer the telecom companies that control these cables as much as the Googles and the Amazons of the world, which are the AI powerhouses. Historically, there was this earlier generation of what you might call convergence when the computing and telecom companies sort of came together in terms of the technologies. And now we're seeing that in the age of AI. And in both instances, as particular companies started to dominate, you really had fairly competitive supply markets turn into oligopolistic markets, which is really the case now with 4 manufacturers dominating the world. And clearly, even if all of them were quote unquote friendly, companies, you're going to have concerns about the supply of equipment, the supply side issues. With the Chinese company being among them, I think there is significant concern, and there are, like Sam pointed out, in both Australia and India, there's at least, if nothing is, at least there's no official policy. There are sort of unofficial ways and means by which certain kinds of equipment are not allowed because of concerns around security. I think those now this once again to sort of reiterate what Sam said. These concerns, because this data is flowing and the volume is so high, and we can't track this data, or isolate data that just flows between Australia and India. This is a sort of the regulation around this must actually be at a multilateral level rather than at a strictly bilateral level. And this is where the announcement, either one at the immediate level is beyond the bilateral is the Quad, and then the sort of the New York Declaration and so on. So I think essentially it is not a solution as much as it's a multi-layered solution, because we're looking at this problem that afflicts multiple countries because these cables are routing and rerouting data from multiple sources to multiple destinations. So as geographers would say, it's multi-scalar, and that's the nature of the regulation that we have to think about, not just in bilateral or unilateral terms. It's not going to work for any country, never mind Australia and India.
Just one more point, if I can.
Yes, Sridhar, yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that we have noticed is that most of the submarine cable projects are also consortium-based, which means that the local cable telcos invest in that consortium, and they have a major share in some of these large submarine cable projects as well. So consortium helps to reduce, for example, the monopoly power of a particular supplier, and therefore, for example, in large submarine cable projects such as the Southeast Asia, Western Europe, Middle East, and there are a lot of telcos from both India and Australia who are part of this consortium, and therefore this consortium-based approach will definitely help in diversifying the risk.
Well, look, I think you may have slightly answered one of our questions from the audience, but I'll put it to you all regardless, in terms of looking at this monopoly that we're talking about, and our island friends in Maldives. Google has recently announced an undersea cable system connecting Maldives, Christmas Island, and Oman. What should Maldives do in terms of securing legislative protection both bilaterally and regionally, e.g. via the Quad or the like? So that's our question from our audience, if someone would like to address that specifically about Maldives.
I mean, I'll jump in. No, I mean, Lisa, I was really curious. So, when I saw this announcement, I thought Maldives was a very curious um, case, and I don't know the details. I don't know why Maldives was selected. I'm not sure, so I'm just speculating. But I mean, I do think that countries, want to position themselves in a way in which they are attractive investment options for these large hyperscalers, whether it be Google or Meta or Amazon, for example. And I think, having robust zones, protection zones, having a friendly environment, business environment, having law enforcement and legal recourse when things go wrong, is a really good way of attracting these businesses to use your islands essentially as a transit hub. So I was very curious in seeing Maldives being selected for this large project, and for example, Christmas Island is being connected according to some of the new cables to Perth and to Darwin, but also up to Singapore. Sorry, Thailand, which was just announced very, very recently. So, I mean, it'd be curious to see whether time will tell whether India was interested in being a landing party for that project, what the rationale behind Maldives was, and what type of arrangements Maldives will put in place to protect those networks. And also, it will be going further on to Oman, which of course is a really important cable landing hub. But I think it gets to some of the importance of having these regulatory environments that can enable international data flows to transit your country, and to have this friendly environment so that you're selected as a landing spot for these cable networks. So I don't have any advice for Maldives specifically, despite perhaps having a look at some of the cable protection zone models, and New Zealand is a really good example as well. And also, I'm sure their military and policing services will be very active in understanding the risks for these new cable networks, especially if Maldives is trying to position itself as a hub for future projects, which I'm sure there'll be more crossing the Indian Ocean.
Thank you, Sam. Yes, well, Maldives is certainly an important hub in terms of its Indian Ocean presence, and obviously Australia's recently, not so recently now, but opened a High Commission there as well, and India has an ongoing relationship with Maldives, which is very important considering India's role in the Indian Ocean. Balaji, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something very briefly. I mean, first of all, I'll start off with a caveat that Sam also mentioned. I obviously don't know the details of this agreement between Google and Maldives. But I actually have a bit of a concern, because all said and done, it's when larger countries have not been able to put in place regulatory guardrails, I wonder what a country that is much smaller like Maldives, whether they have the capability to deal with the kind of technological and other might that a company like Google brings. And we don't know what the argument was what the agreement was rather between the country and Google itself. So in the sense that to what extent are sort of national interests of Maldives itself being protected, and what is it that the country gets out of it, and what does Google get out of it, in terms of just sort of, while you have access to data flows and so on, I can say that, but in terms of employment generation, etc., most of these things are not very the numbers, and we're not talking large numbers. I think, to me, I think here's where the Australia Pacific, the financing mechanism that's put in place seems to be a little more sort of what shall I say, it draws less concern because, the thing is there you have a country like Australia that's creating this as part of a regional network. And you have a country with Australia's capabilities that's building this connectivity to smaller islands in the Pacific Ocean. Whereas here you just have a little country up against one of the biggest companies in the world, and we don't really know what the outcome is going to be, who's going to be calling the shots here. I think that's a different kind of a perspective rather than just saying, are we going to be able to ensure that data keeps flowing?
I would add as well, Lisa, that I mean, this, in many respects, this announcement to connect Maldives with this new cable. I mean, Maldives is connected to cables that do cross that part of the world, but this is creating this subsea mesh, and that cable networks are no longer, well, are still point to point, but creating these new hubs, these new digital hubs, creates this mesh and creates these alternative paths and these alternative ways in which data can flow if some cables are fouled due to whatever reason. So in a regional sense, and perhaps even in a global sense, connecting the large players, but also connecting the smaller players with these transoceanic cables is a really positive step when it comes to data, the resiliency of our subsea networks.
Sure. Look, we have another question from our audience that I might put to you, Sridhar. It relates to national infrastructure sovereignty. And the question itself asks, regional cooperation in any domain often requires some pooling of sovereignty or sacrificing some sovereignty in the interests of greater good. Would India's focus on infrastructure sovereignty pose any challenges in developing greater regional cooperation in submarine cable security?
That's a good point. That's a good point. So, in fact, for example, if you know, there is something called as a data localization regulation, which has been put in place in India for the last 3-4 years. So, which mandates all the data to be residing locally, if it has to serve, for example, the Indian residents. That's a big regulatory bottleneck, which is seen by multinationals as a very big bottleneck. But at the same time, it provides opportunities for Indian startups to have data locally and compete on a same ground with the multinationals. So any regulatory constraint that we are going to put in order to promote, for example, sovereignty is going to have an impact on especially the multinational and the transporter data flows and things like that. So when we talk about sovereignty, we need to be really conscious about protection and resiliency of the network, improving trusted networks, and probably encouraging local indigenous manufacturers in order to play a vital role in the submarine cable landing stations as well as submarine cable systems. So that is a trade-off that we need to make, but that's something India and Australia can probably partner and then develop some standard operating processes so that we maintain sovereignty, but at the same time promote regional and international data flow seamlessly.
Okay, well, just on that's interesting. I mean, in terms of this area of cable security, we know that when we talk about submarine cable security, it's cutting across all sorts of different parts of government in terms of defense, in terms of international development, telecommunications, digital economy policy, all of it. Requires all sorts of institutional arrangements or at least coordination mechanisms to ensure submarine cable security is being sort of holistically addressed. So I just wondered what sort of mechanisms that could be in place or could help be in place, I should say, to help both of our countries break down the silos that we know exists to sort of sustain our attention on cable security over time.
So I'll just make one point, Lisa, on this. So we need as you have correctly pointed out, it cuts across the ministries, departments, and governments, and therefore we need a horizontal regulator. So, for example, if you look at, India, for example, the submarine cable regulation is being solely looked at by the Telecommunications Regulatory Authority of India, which comes under the Department of Telecommunications. So the other departments and ministries are not involved. So I think Sam can talk about Australia as well. So we need a horizontal regulator. An excellent example is, for example, the privacy and data protection regulator, which cuts across all the departments and then handles all the privacy and data protection issues which are common across various industry verticals and ministries and so on. So it is time to think about a regulator, a horizontal regulator, which cuts across the department functions in order to manage the regulation of subsea cables. So Sam can possibly talk something about what is in store in Australia as well.
Oh, it's a really good question on the regulatory space and even beyond just regulatory, but the policy space and just the question of, well, who owns this this issue in terms of policy? I'm actually sitting here in Canberra right now with the Department of Infrastructure across the road, and well, they're actually the ones responsible through their agencies here in the Australian system. So, but I think beyond that, you know, it's this question of, well, who has the policy role? And you know, in the Australian system, I think there's still important questions to be answered around what's Defence's role, what's our Home Affairs and our Border Forces role, our Maritime Border Command and the Foreign Affairs and Trade Department as well, and where we have various agencies with important equities in this space. But because it is such a cross-cutting issue, even in the Australian system, and also because, you know, in Australia we do have relatively few cable breaks when we compare to other parts of the world. You know, it since the Cold War, perhaps it hasn't been as high a priority. But I do think that with fracturing global order and with these concerning incidents we're seeing in the Baltic, but also in Yemen and Taiwan, there is a bit more of a greater focus and a greater policy attention on the safeguarding of these infrastructures. But Lisa, I would mention one more mechanism, and I think I meant it's mentioned in the report, but I think it's really important around ensuring that submarine cable security and protection is part of our regional maritime security arrangements, whether that's through the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium or the Indian Ocean Rim Association, making sure that these issues are discussed at that multilateral regional level. But just as important is ensuring that the types of scenarios that we don't want to see play out on the seabed are worked into military and Coast Guard exercises. So there's a range of exercises that countries do together and also in groupings. And it would be really good to see the types of responses be tested in scenario-based circumstances, and also ensuring that industry and the owners and the operators of these infrastructures are part of those arrangements. So I think that there's a lot of existing mechanisms for maritime security, especially, that can be mobilized, and that cable security should form a part of their general exercises and their general planning and preparedness.
Well, thank you, Sam. I have to say, as a multilateralist living in a world where multilateralism is waning, it's wonderful to hear about policy ideas and recommendations that really, in submarine cables, that really give it strength through that multilateral mechanism. So that's really, really encouraging to hear. Just on the security, while we're still on the issue of security, I do have another question from the audience, which is really quite a good question in terms of the Australia-India partnership. So the question, firstly, just the prefaces by talking about Vizag, obviously in India, being set as a critical landing hub, and Australia's deep integration in the Five Eyes intelligence network. So the question goes to, does the Australia-India partnership offer a pathway for India to align with Five Eyes standards of trusted connectivity, effectively making India a trusted geography for the alliance? Or do differing data and security protocols create a ceiling for how deep this integration can go? So in other words, does India's non-member status in Five Eyes introduce security friction points for Australia that could limit sensitive traffic routing or cooperation between the two? who would like to go on that? Sam?
Well, if I'm left with that hot potato, yeah, no, look, I mean, to be fair, it's a little outside the scope of the study that we're doing at the moment. I think, I don't know how public Five Eyes data protocols and security protocols really is. I mean, it's a really important point, and I think we've seen, though, that it come out in media and the way in which militaries and the way in which governments have a stake in these cable networks can often be quite opaque. So I think it's a really important question, and that often even civilian telecommunications infrastructures are often used by governments for their communications, yeah, I think it's quite an opaque area, and it's really difficult to answer that. But I certainly don't think that Five Eyes standards stop collaboration and have stopped cable networks between Australia and India. And certainly, even though there aren't any cable networks in existence now, Meta's Waterworth cable, for example, will connect the two countries. And I'm very confident that we'll see more cable networks connecting the two countries directly. But of course, there will be, and there are a range of routes between the two countries that indeed we're using right now to host this webinar. So, but I'm not sure if my colleagues have any views on this one.
So can I follow Sam? I've always been following Sam. So I would like to draw a parallel, Lisa. This is the adequacy rules, which is being proposed by European Union for data protection regulation. For example, if the adequacy rules are met, then there is a free data flow between EU and other countries. So there are a list of countries which have fulfilled this particular adequacy norms. So similar to that, we can also have adequacy norms with respect to security of subsea cables, framed by India and Australia together, so that we can include, we can create another Big Eyes alliance, right, with respect to subsea cables, who satisfy these adequacy rules, so that we become trusted networks across countries. That is one view that we can possibly take.
Thank you, Sridhar. I think, all of this really comes back to the importance of Australia and India having a trusted relationship. And I think we can all agree that it continues to go from strength to strength in terms of it being a trusted relationship, but it is an ongoing work in progress that we all need to work at. I had more questions for you as I read through the report. Particularly, we haven't had a chance to touch on repair capacity and crisis response. We hear about cables going down and through all sorts of clandestine means through the media, but you as co-authors really delve into that issue, as you did at the dialogue in Perth, on the issues of regional repair capacity and crisis response, and the mix of public policy, commercial models and partnerships that are needed to address that across both Indian Ocean and Pacific Oceans. So that is there in your report for our listeners, our audience and others to read on the landing page of the Australia-India Institute's website, as is a range of other issues, such as the report very much looks at technological changes, future trends in terms of that, and how those sort of shifts in technology will affect our region and what policymakers should do to respond to that. So many parts of this report is so useful for this piece, a growing piece of policy area for our region, which was only going to continue to grow. And we've been very fortunate to have our three panelists join to share their expertise today on the Securing Indo-Pacific Submarine Cable Networks Options for Australia-India Cooperation report, which has been now launched and available today on the Institute's website. So thank you very much to our panellists. Your reflections very much on these challenges, on the current policy settings, the practical options for Australia, but also for India to strengthen connectivity, resilience and repair, really, I think, underlines just how central submarine cables are to our region's security and prosperity. So thank you, Sam. Thank you, Balaji. Thank you, Sridhar.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.
And as I said, this is also thanks to DFAT, the AICCTP, for supporting this initiative. The discussion, I think, very much has highlighted the opportunities for deeper collaboration between our two countries, but also through, connectivity projects, stronger legal and regulatory frameworks, we can really look at new forms of regional partnerships right across the Indo-Pacific region. So a very big thank you to our audience, particularly those that wrote in questions that I'm pleased we got to. Thank you for your engagement and thoughtful questions. And also, just to let everyone know, this webinar will be available as a recording shortly on the Institute's website. So look back for that along with the full report. And please feel free to revisit and share it with your networks. So thank you. I look forward to continuing this conversation as Australia, India, and our partners in the region work together to secure the digital backbone of the Indo-Pacific region so that it remains peaceful and prosperous for all. Thank you.